Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Google Maps Garage. I'm Paul Saxman, and with me is Mano Marks. And this week we're going to talk about advanced map markers using the Google Maps utility library. So Mano, you're probably a little more familiar with the Google Maps utility library than I am. Do you want to give a little overview of?
Sure. So the Google Maps utility library started. Well, we actually had one for Maps API v2, and we now have migrated a lot of those functionality to v3. And basically the idea is similar to a lot of other APIs where they have what are called plugins. We released utility libraries that work with the API to add additional functionality. And one of the reasons we do it this way instead of putting them into the main API is because we do them in a fairly specific way, but we want to allow people through the open source library to modify the behaviors of each of the individual libraries. So in these cases, since they're all open source, you can then go in and actually pull out the source and change it to behave in the way that you want. So for instance, I'm going to be talking about Marker Clusterer. And there are different clustering algorithms that one can use in this way. You can then modify the clustering algorithm to suit your own needs.
And not only can you actually pull the code out and modify it for your own needs, but then you can also contribute it back to the project. Right. We do have some guidelines, I think, for contributing back to the project.
Right.
I think probably code styling and. But yeah, if you have any ideas or code, I think it would be a great thing for us in the community.
It's all hosted on Google code.google.com, and we will provide a link to that in the description of the video, and it's also linked off the documentation under more resources for the JavaScript API.
Yep. And I personally never remember, so I always just search for it.
Yeah, if you search for Google Maps API utility library,
Google Maps.
You'll find it.
And there's a number of different. So first hit, I just searched on Google Maps utility library. It's actually in Google Code Hosting. So the source repository, I think, is Subversion, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right. And if you click on the wiki, it actually has pages that describe. So there's one that for libraries that gives you the quick link to each of the libraries that are there. We're not going to have time to go through each of the libraries, but we're gonna concentrate on some that are specific to markers and the ones that we feel are the most broadly applicable to what you guys need.
Yep. Yeah, and if we take a look at the screen here, so the Google Maps utility library v3, the v3 is because it's for the JS library version 3. Lots of stuff in here, like Mano said. I mean, key drag zoom info box, marker cluster. Actually, you're going to talk about marker cluster plus, I think.
No, I'm just going to talk the basic marker clusterer, but marker clusterer plus simply adds a few additional options, which I won't get to.
Cool. And I'm going to talk about the styled marker and rich marker, because there are two ways you can pretty easily get kind of nice effects or nice styles for your markers, besides just the kind of standard push pin. So with that, and I definitely recommend if you haven't used the utility library, just kind of come here, check out the wiki on the front, and kind of browse through and see some of the others. Not all these were developed by us, since this is an open source project. A lot of these are submitted by the community members. So try to provide attribution for those, because I think the first one I'm going to start out with is styled marker. That was actually contributed by, if we go back to the code, Gabriel Schneider. Looks like Gabriel committed this around 2010. Mm-hmm. So styled marker is actually the styled marker library is actually a really simple way to get custom styles, either custom markers or, well, actually just custom marker styles in the form of either markers, your classic markers, which is the kind of the inverted teardrop, or bubbles. And the way it does this, the library does this, is it actually uses another Google API, the Charts API, to render these on the screen. So you can see here, if we go back to the screen, I have 5 different types of markers on here. And these all use the library for generating these. So this is just a form of a bubble with some custom text. These are actually just variations of the standard marker. Nice thing about this library, you can provide your own text not only into the bubble but also into the markers. And I believe with the markers themselves, you can actually provide up to 2 characters. So if you have a lot of data and you want to go from A to Z back to AA to AB, something like that, you can do it. Or, for example,
hex code your markers.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Even better. Another thing you can do, you can obviously, just get rid of all the information and just do the standard marker. And there's a little feature in there, you can actually add this little star, which is kind of cute, I think. A nice way to kind of highlight some information. Another interesting thing about this too is that so the styled marker class in JavaScript, it actually inherits from the marker class. So things like like dragability, flat, whether or not you want to render a shadow or not, that's all built in. You just modify those parameters the exact same way you would if you're dealing with a standard marker. So this is really kind of like a marker plus, and I'll show you real quick how that looks like in code. So you can see this is what I've done is that you have to actually download and import this library. An alternative to that is that you can probably link to it directly from our code site. So just rely on the fact that that code is there. The only difference would be, or the only question about that would be, is if you're linking it directly from code site. If the library changes in some way. Or if you want to modify the library, you're probably going to want to keep a local copy. But as I said before, if we take a look here, so the styled marker, you're actually creating these the exact same way you create a marker. You're passing in a position and a map. You can also pass in the additional information like dragability or whether or not you want a shadow rendered, or if you want to change the anchoring. And but the difference with the styled marker is you're passing in a styled icon. The style icon is just actually a pretty simple class. It takes a type of marker. So this is either going to be a bubble or a marker. So by marker, I mean the inverted teardrop, and the bubble is actually kind of the comic style kind of thought bubble. And then you actually provide some style properties. And there's, I believe in the bubble, there's, I think, just 3 different style properties. You can either do the color, the text, and the star. And then with the other way around. I'm sorry. So with the marker, you can do color, text, and star. But with the bubble, you do the color and text. And you can also change I think the property is 4. I might have an example of that in here. For actually changing the foreground color. So you can actually change the coloring of the text as well. I believe that works with both the bubble and the marker. So you create the style icon, you create your marker, and you pass in the style icon. Really nice thing about this, also another nice thing about the style marker is that these styles you can actually change dynamically. So if I take a look, I actually put one of these in the global context or the global scope, so that I can actually go back to my developer tools, and let's go here, open up my developer tools. And find my console. Oh yeah, pin it down to the bottom. Go to my console. Can we blow this up? Yeah. And so here I'm accessing the style icon, and I can do things like, actually, let's do this the other way around. I can look at my properties. I can do things like change the color, and equals, I believe it's, actually no, it's just setting the property. So I'm going to do this actually, let's go back to my code real quick. So style icon, what property do I want to do? Well, actually, probably a better way around, if I were to do this, maybe just take my marker class, and I can actually just apply the style itself. So create a new style icon. But since these are, if I go back to this and just reload it, get my marker in the global context. And then save that, reload my page. I can go back to my my marker now and marker 1 and do things like the let's see, set options. Like I said before, with the change things like dragability. If I get this correct, and now you can see things like these markers are now draggable. So it's and that's kind of the example I had down here. So things like the flatness. So you can see this doesn't have a shadow. This one's also draggable. So these style properties, they're actually dynamically changeable. So not only the marker properties, but also the style properties. Maybe I can do a demonstration of that at another time. So the rich marker. So an interesting thing about style marker, I mentioned before that it uses the image API, or the image chart API that Google provides. And the way that API works is actually rendering these markers actually on the server side. So you pass the properties, you get the image back, and then you can actually render that in your website. Unfortunately, that API has been announced for deprecation, which is bad news. But the good news is it's going to be around for at least another 2.5 years. So I think it's sometime in April 2015 or something to that effect. So another caveat with this API is that if you it's likely safe to use for at least the next couple of years. But if you're building something for a partner or for consulting and building it for another company, you probably don't want to use this API just to be on the safe side, because you probably don't want them calling you up in a couple of years saying that their marker's no longer rendering properly. The interesting thing, though, is that I'm guessing, since this is actually built on top of the marker class, that it might just default back to the original markers if it can't get an image. I haven't tested that out, but definitely for like short-term projects, this is a really easy way to get markers on your map, a really quick and easy way. The alternative, though, is the rich marker. So rich marker basically allows you, it's very similar in that it's the interface is a lot like the marker class, but it allows you to actually pass in HTML code for rendering your marker. And it also supports all the standard marker properties, things like dragability and flatness for setting the shadow, and anchor as well. So you can actually change where it's rendered. And also, like markers or overlays in general, is that you can also set different maps or take it out of the maps, changes visibility and that type of thing. So here's an example. If we go back to the screen, so this is an example of a rich marker. You can see this is actually a really nice piece of HTML code. It has some text in here. It has an image, actually. You can see if you look around the edge, it actually has the shadowing. That's because it is not flat. It's actually hovering above the image. This one I actually have dragability on, so you can see I can move it around. But if we go over here, I actually created this little widget over here that lets me actually change some of the properties dynamically. So, for example, if I just click that dragability, toggle dragability, you can now see that this marker isn't draggable. I'm doing that just by setting the options on the class itself. You can do things like flat. If I do flatness, you see the background disappears, and visibility, we can toggle that as well pretty easily. So the really interesting thing about this, though, is that this has this concept of content, HTML content. So you give it some HTML code that you want it to render or inside of the marker. So here we have some simplified, just says hello, and it has a background of green. If I set that content on the object, you can see that the style of my marker changes dramatically. And I can still go back and change the other properties as well. So we go back to the code. This one's the interface is a little bit different from marker class, because it's actually implementing the overlay. Is that again the overlay view? But it actually works very much the same. So you can see here I'm creating a rich marker class. I'm giving position, the map, set dragability and anchor on this one. And the big difference now is that I'm passing in content. This is the HTML content. Doing things, so there's actually a lot of convenient methods on this class. You can do things like get flat and set flat, get draggable, set draggable. I don't believe these exist on marker. You generally, I think, access these through the options. So it's a little bit different. These are actually kind of convenient methods, but they are very handy. But you can also go back and actually do the set options on the class and pass in like a content object or set the dragability by changing the options of the marker itself. So either way, what I'd say is that if you want this kind of interchangeable with the classic marker, so if let's say you want to create one of these, and then later in your code you want to be agnostic to whether or not it's a rich marker, a static or standard marker, or even a styled marker, just use the options, pass in different options. If the class doesn't support that option, it's just ignored. So for example, if I have a marker class and I pass in the content option, I'm just going to render a standard marker. So because that option, the content will be ignored. And that's a nice way for example, like I said before, with the styled marker, if the styled marker goes away at some point, all you'd have to do at that point is just go into the top of your code and change when you're instantiating these. Instead of instantiating a styled marker, switch it over to a rich marker, and then the rest of your code would just work because you're relying on the standard set options property or function. So that's it for the markers, these two styled markers. Very handy. You can do a lot with them. You can dynamically change their style, dynamically change the content. But in terms of like more advanced stuff, I'm going to hand it off to Mano.
So just one more point on that. I think these two libraries, the rich marker and the styled marker, just really convey how extensible the Maps API is through inheritance and our MVC objects. So hopefully we'll be doing another session on that fairly soon. But I just really encourage you to actually start playing with that kind of extensibility within the Maps API, that you don't need to be stuck with just the properties and methods that are defined by the Maps API itself.
Actually, like if you do have a chance to like look at the code for the styled marker, styled markers is pretty straightforward because it's actually just changing the icon using one of these icons generated by the image chart API. But styled marker, on the other hand, like I said, it uses the overlay, I think it's overlay layer. And that's how you actually can plot pretty much any information on top of a map and have it synchronized with the movement. So it's a very powerful technique for putting information on a map. It's just that this library wraps all the kind of not necessarily complexity, but wraps the concept of the canvas layer with the canvas layer or canvas view. So with the concept of the marker, which makes it very convenient to use.
So the next one that I'm going to discuss is Marker Manager. So actually both of the ones that I'm going to discuss get at a problem of too many markers on your map. Now, too many markers on your map has a couple of different effects. One is it slows down your browser. That's an issue, but it's also very cluttering. So if you have tons of stuff on your map, it actually can get hard to navigate to and find the things that you want, and also get a clear sense of how many things are in a particular area. So Marker Manager handles this in one way, which is it allows you in a very simple way to show only a limited number of markers per zoom level. And what it does is it breaks down the viewport into grids and then randomly distributes your markers that you've created into that grid. So for instance, you'll see here this is a random weather map. This has this isn't using any actual data, but just some random weather data generated by the JavaScript. And you'll see that there are about 20 markers on it right now. And at this particular zoom level, that's how many there are. As I zoom out, the markers will actually disappear, or more of them will be created. And as you can see here, I think we have about 200 markers here. So this creates an effect very much like you'll see in many maps where, as you can watch the actual background of the map tiles, you see how the style changes as you zoom in and zoom out, and you'll get more, smaller cities will start to appear. You can simulate that same effect using Marker Manager.
So really the idea, so as you zoom in, you're going from global information to kind of regional information to local information.
Exactly.
And this kind of manages the complexity of kind of how much you display. That's
right.
Cool.
So you'll see here there's a bunch of setup for the map, but basically you import in the Marker Manager source. All of these libraries have both a compiled and non-compiled version, which allows you to, the compiled versions obviously have better performance, and the non-compiled versions have more readability in them. So in this case, this is just the sample that's right in the utility library, but it's loading in the script, and it depends on which option you've passed in, compiled or not. So then what we do is we set up the map, we create the map, and we add a listener for when the bounds change to set up the weather markers. And set up weather markers creates a bunch of random markers, but also creates a new Marker Manager and puts it onto the map. And then every time you add a marker, you're going to add one into add it into the Marker Manager. And then the manager, you then pass in some options. So you'll see here in these 3 lines, you add markers, so you get weather markers 20, and it pulls in 3. So basically what this is saying is, give me an array of 20 markers that will show up at zoom level 3. And then at zoom level 6, give me an array of 200 markers, and at zoom level 8, 1,000. And for those of you who are relatively new to the Maps API, the zoom levels, zoom level 0 is the farthest out, and as you each zoom level addition pulls you closer to the map. So that's basically how it works. It's actually a really easy one to do, and then you refresh the manager. After you've created it, then you then refresh it to start displaying the markers, and then the manager just takes care of all the rest. The other example, which is used quite a bit more, is called Marker Clusterer. So you'll see here, I actually took the radar search example, which is in our documentation, that pulls in 200 locations that have the text best view in Sydney, and places them on the map with these little star icons. And you see I can click here and I get the name of the location. What this does with Marker Cluster is it automatically clusters them. I give the markers, instead of giving them to the map, I give them to the clusterer, and then the clusterer creates clusters. So you'll see here I've got, in this marker I have 14. If I click on that marker, it zooms in and breaks apart the cluster into smaller clusters. But you'll see here that these outlying stars that are farther away from the center of the cluster will actually show up on their own. And as I break them down, you just get the actual locations. So this is a good way of conveying the exact number of things in an individual area. And you can see as I zoom out, it reclusters. And it handles changing the style. There's automatic ways in which it changes the style, and you'll see the numbers here above 10 are in what is that, orange, I guess?
Orangish,
Yes.
yeah.
Sorry, I have a slight red deficiency in my my vision. So those are orangish, and then you see as I pull out even farther,
So they're really
will
capturing
reclustering.
Density as well, which is a nice.
Right. And so over 100, you actually get red. And so what it got was a total of 191 results. So this is the code for this is pretty simple. Again, you create what I did here was I created a markers array, which is initialized right here. And then I'm pulling in the places search. And when the bounds change, it actually performs the search. We've covered places before, so I'm not going to go too much detail in that. But basically, I'm adding an event that performs a search, and at the end of the performing of the search, it has a callback. The callback is just called callback. And at the end of that, I create a marker cluster, and I assign it to the map, and I assign the array of markers to it. So this is the simplest example. I'm doing no real customization of the map. I'm doing of the cluster. I'm just saying you handle all the options here and figure out how to actually do it.
So if we do look like when you're creating your marker class there, you're not specifying the map, right? So
right. So that's the important thing. When I create an actual marker, I do not specify a class in the process. Sorry, a marker in the process. So did I just say a marker?
You do not assign the map.
You do not assign the map.
Or map to the marker.
Because if you assign the marker to the map, then it's going to display it on the map. You assign it to the cluster, and the cluster figures out when to assign it to the map. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So this is a little bit different from the last example we saw was sort of the marker manager, in that where the marker manager, as you're zooming in, you're displaying more information.
Right.
This one, likewise, we're displaying more information, right? Because the markers are expanding. Except that with the clustering, you still get things like the density, and you also get the information about the number of markers that are clustered within each of these.
That's right.
Kind of meta markers. So you're preserving a lot more information using this technique.
Right. On the flip side of that, you are not doing. With Marker Manager, you can sort of say, okay, at this level, these are the ones that you display. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Marker Cluster, it's just making decisions on. It's effectively displaying them all, but within these clusters instead of at different zoom levels.
Right. And I've seen. We don't have examples of this today, though, but there's other clustering techniques as well, right? Like I've seen things like the spider web clustering and the
right.
So the idea of clustering is pretty powerful.
Right.
And if you do want to,
heat maps is an extreme variation of that, right?
True,
it's basically giving you information about density of objects in an area. There are some advanced options. I'm going to just do a quick example here. This is from the official utility library. You can actually set the max zoom level in which markers will be clustered. So if I set it here at 7, at a certain point, if I get down below 7, it will just automatically break up all the clusters. And I chose a bad area where there are actually no clusters. But if, for instance, I zoom in here, it'll break them up fairly quickly. I can also choose cluster size. So you'll see before this was around, that's what I didn't do, was refresh the map. So I can make the clusters bigger or smaller. So it will attempt to put them into clusters around size 80. And here you see the max zoom level there. I can also change the styling. So force this to default. So here we have, I can style the icons with custom icons. So you can choose your own icons for the different styles. And one thing that, that people will do is instead of creating just one cluster, they may create several marker clusterers if they want to cluster different kinds of objects. So if I wanted to have, you know, a people or a heart as my icon, you might have a cluster of people and a cluster of heart icons.
Yeah, I think, I mean, both of these techniques I think are very useful. I mean, not only for like visualizations, like if you want to, you know, display like density of, you know, I don't know what this is, but density of
random things.
Random things on your map, but also, you know, just as a standard technique for maps, right? Because a lot of people, let's say if you want a restaurant finder, you know, you probably don't want to display a marker for every restaurant in Europe if the user zoomed out at a certain level. So you can use this technique to kind of let users kind of drill down. So it's kind of broadly applicable, I think.
Yeah. For instance, you have an auto retail site, and you want to show where all your dealerships are. In large cities, there may be a lot of them, but if somebody's looking over Europe, they want to know where's the place that I can go so I can try a bunch of different dealerships to try and get the deal that I want or the specific car that I want. So they'll look for the cities with the most markers in them.
Cool. Okay, well, with that, I think that's it for our demos today, or for what we're going to talk about. I mean, it seems like we could even have a whole talk on clustering at some point, because it's a really powerful tool, I think. And
well, not just this, but yeah, looking at different algorithms for clustering and stuff. If you do searches online for clustering algorithms, you'll find a lot of different ways in which people have implemented these kind of clusters.
Cool. All right, so that's it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them in the YouTube stream or in the Google Plus post. And you know, we'll try to get back to you. If you have any ideas for shows, if you really want to see more marker clustering, you know, let us know as well, or ideas for future shows. And with that, we'll catch you next week.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone.